justice, all important, but unfortunately, what is more important now is what's happening on the ground in Libya. And on the ground in Libya, the power of Gaddafi's forces are winning over the forces of freedom in a fight that is not fair.
I'd say to my friend from Connecticut, I think that's a very strong and eloquent statement. And you know, I admit to the fact that the terrible tragedy that's transpiring in Japan is one that has riveted the attention of our nation and the world. And our hearts go out to the Japanese people and government in this terrible time of trial. And there's no way we can diminish the tragedy that they're experiencing. But it is a natural disaster that was the catalyst for this terrible situation. Meanwhile, in Libya, we have a human catalyst named Muammar Gaddafi. And I will admit, I will confess to having such a dull life that I watch a lot of cable television. And I see expert after expert come before the cameras and give us reasons why the United States should do nothing. So I commend to reading my colleagues an article in today's New York Times by Anne Marie Slaughter, who was former policy planning at the State Department, I understand, in this administration or in another. And it really does respond to what you will hear continuously. The article's entitled Fiddling While Libya Burns. And at the beginning, she points out that the Organization of the Islamic Conference, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and now the Arab League have all called for this imposing a no-fly zone. And she runs through the objections that have been raised by various individuals and, quote, experts. One is titled, "It's not in our interest." Another is, "It will be counterproductive." Another one, that it won't work. Another one, if it does work, we don't know what we will get. Let's arm the rebels instead. And it addresses most of the main arguments. The only one that I think that should be added to this list is the likelihood that things are happening in Libya today as we speak that will remind us that several times in the last century, and even in this, we said never again. We said never again after Srebrenica. We said never again after Rwanda. We said never again after the Holocaust. And several other occasions when nations stood by while slaughter was taking place. Is there anyone who believes that Gaddafi has not practiced in the past and is practicing now and will in the future unspeakable cruelties inflicted upon his people who dare to stand up to him? So I'd say to my friend, here we are. We know what's happened in Tripoli. We know what's happening with air attacks that are taking place on defenseless individuals. And we watch these brave young people go out there with their Kalashnikovs and others fighting against tanks and air power. And as former President Clinton said so eloquently, it's not a fair fight. It's not a fair fight. So I guess that there will be other consultations with our allies that we will. I'm glad to see that the Secretary of State is meeting with the leadership of the provisional government. I hope she will, as a result of that meeting, ask for United States recognition of that organization as the legitimate government of the country of Libya. And I hope all these things will happen. But meanwhile, events unfolding on the ground, every second and every minute we wait to act, more Libyans die. This is a preventable situation. The events in Tokyo, maybe we can argue, in Japan, were not preventable. It was an act of God. What's happening in Libya is an act of a brutal tyrant, sadist, who is willing to butcher his own people. And we're doing everything we can, and we'll do everything we can to help the people of Japan. We ought to be doing what we can to help the people of Libya from the fate that in some cases to some individuals may be worse than death. So I hope that my colleagues will, I hope the majority leader will allow a vote on this sense of the Senate resolution as soon as possible. I understand that there will be those who may like to see slightly different language. We'd be glad to change the language somewhat, but we won't change the message. The message is the United States of America, the Senate of the United States of America, is standing on the side of people who are standing up for freedom and democracy, a universal value that we treasure. And we will not stint in our obligations. And those who say that the most powerful nation in the world is incapable of helping these people by installing a no-fly zone, I think, are not substantiated by the facts. General Raymond Odierno just the other day said we could install a no-fly zone in just a few days. We could have naval power offshore that could enforce it in a variety of ways, both from the sea as well as from the air. And also, it is very clear to me that if Libyan pilots are told that if you fly, you're going to die, a lot of them won't fly. But I don't want to focus so much attention on the no-fly zone as I do on what's happening to the people of Libya as we speak and the repercussions that could take place throughout the globe. So I hope we can vote on this sooner rather than later, and I'd ask my friend from Connecticut, I believe we're nearly out of time in a few minutes.
I thank my friend from Arizona. Mr. President, I just want to conclude by saying this. In our history in this country, we've been quite fortunate, and it may be that, as a friend of mine said to me, it's hard for people to imagine themselves in a position where they would need help. They need help to rescue them from danger, from death. And Senator McCain cited some of the episodes, dark times in just recent history, where people needed that help from outside. The Holocaust, Srebrenica in the Balkans, Rwanda, and we acted. This is of that same type. And but it struck me that there are, as we think about Japan, there is this parallel to the U.S. There have been natural disasters in this country, earthquakes, hurricanes. Hurricane Katrina is an example. When the people of the Gulf Coast region pleaded with us, the central government, the national government, federal government, for help, and we gave it to them. Who will ever forget what the Coast Guard did in rescuing lives in the Gulf Coast after Katrina? And in some ways, I think we have to perhaps see it as, although it's a man-made disaster, as a natural disaster with people asking for basic rescue. And in this case, they're not asking us to fight their fight, I repeat. They're asking us to give them the weapons, the covers, so that they can fight their fight. That's the intention of this resolution. Bottom line, recognize the opposition to Gaddafi in Benghazi as the government, legitimate sovereign government of Libya, and then work with our allies in the world community, including, I hope, not only our NATO allies, but our allies in the Arab League and the Gulf Council, to enforce, to protect the Libyan people from Gaddafi's Air Force. I join with Senator McCain in saying that I hope Senator Reid, Senator McConnell can agree on a way to bring this resolution up quickly, because every moment that passes without us helping the Libyan opposition to make it a fair fight is a moment in which darkness descends over Libya. And again, I repeat what Senator McCain said, that we're willing to discuss changes in the resolution because we'd like this to be a resolution that has the broadest possible bipartisan support in the Senate. Mr. President, if I can, I'd like to just take a minute more to just say this word that came to my mind over the weekend about the terrible natural disaster in Japan. Prime Minister.
Switches, just to ask unanimous consent that the Wall Street Journal editorial entitled "The Obama Doctrine" and the New York Times article this morning, "Fiddling While Libya Burns," and the interview with the Libyan resistance leader entitled "Rebel Leader, Give Us a Chance," the dailybeast.com of this morning, be included in the record.
Without objection.
I thank the Chair, and I thank Senator McCain. Over the weekend, Prime Minister Khan of Japan described this earthquake and tsunami as the worst thing to happen to Japan since World War II. And I suppose what struck me struck probably a lot of other Americans, which was that, of course, Japan and the United States were at war with each other in World War II. Today, the U.S.-Japan relationship is extremely close. I believe we don't have a better, more steadfast ally in Asia than the Japanese people. And it's part of why I hope the people of Japan understand that the people of the United States are with them at this moment in which they suffer so from this natural disaster, and will do everything we can to help them. They're a proud people, but now they can't handle this all alone, and we want to help them. We're a proud people, but I want to share with my colleagues a conversation I had with a gentleman who was in the American Embassy, serving in the American Embassy in Tokyo at the time of Hurricane Katrina. And he told me yesterday that Japanese people lined up outside our embassy in Tokyo after they heard about, watched films of Hurricane Katrina, to offer help, whatever they could offer. And one private citizen of Japan, unannounced, arrived at the embassy and wrote out a private check for $1 million for Hurricane Katrina relief. I mean, this is the closeness of the relationship. And I hope that, and I'm confident that we will be as supportive of the Japanese people as they respond to this earthquake and tsunami and rebuild as they were to the people of the Gulf Coast in America in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. I thank the Chair, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, as the Senator from Arizona and the Senator from Connecticut have done in their ways eloquently, I would like to express on behalf of the people of Tennessee my sympathy, our sympathy to the people of Japan and the devastation they've experienced. I applaud the administration and the American people for their immediate response to offer assistance, charitable aid, and search and rescue teams to find survivors. There's no more important two-country alliance than that of Japan or the United States. The former Majority Leader and Ambassador Mike Mansfield used to teach that to all of us younger governors during the 1980s and 90s. And we will stand with the people of Japan until they recover from this disaster. There's a special relationship between the Japanese and Tennesseans because of the location of so many Japanese industries in our state over the last 30 years. So as a result, Tennesseans have been reaching out to our friends and their families in Japan. We should also commend the Japanese for their courage that they've shown in dealing with the devastation, and particularly with their level-headed response to the damage at their nuclear reactors at Fukushima Daiichi. In this age when instant communication can sometimes create misinformation and even panic, the Japanese leadership and nuclear scientists are working with organizations from around the world in responding to the danger and keeping the rest of the world informed. This is the largest earthquake in Japan's recorded history, 30 times more forceful than the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, 700 times stronger than the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. So while the risk is no means over, and the events in Japan continue to evolve, the reactor safety systems so far appear to have done their job in withstanding the earthquakes, tsunami, power loss, and explosions, and none of the reactor containment structures seem to have been breached in these worst-case conditions. So the lessons that Americans can take away from this tragedy is this: learn all we can from the Japanese experience to make the operation of American reactors as safe as possible. Mr. President, I'd ask for an additional 5 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, since the 1950s, the United States Navy has safely traveled more than 136 million miles on nuclear power. Today, 104 civilian reactors produce 20% of America's electricity and 70% of our clean electricity. That is, without sulfur, without nitrogen, without mercury, or without carbon. No one has ever died from a nuclear accident at any of our commercial or Navy reactors. Let me say that again. No one has ever died from a reactor accident at one of our Navy or commercial reactors. Without nuclear power, it is hard to imagine how the United States could produce enough cheap, reliable, clean electricity to keep our economy moving and keep our jobs from going overseas. Here's what we know about what has happened in Japan. We've all seen the video of the explosion of the building at Daiichi Unit 1 and now Unit 3, and I'm sure that many of us have thought that those were reactors exploding. Fortunately, that's not what happened. A buildup of hydrogen gas in the secondary containment structures led to explosions which destroyed the buildings themselves, but the primary containment structures inside appear not to have been compromised. To reduce the resulting increase in containment pressure, a relatively small amount of radioactive vapor has been dispersed into the atmosphere. The Tokyo Electric Power Company has told us that the highest level of radiation detected on site to date is 155.7 millirem per hour, and that level has since been reduced to 4.4 millirem per hour. What does that mean in regard to human exposure risk? To help put that in perspective, here's a couple of facts. The average American receives about 300 millirem of radiation exposure each year from naturally occurring sources such as the sun, and another 300 millirem of radiation exposure from medical applications such as CT scans and X-rays. What did happen after the earthquake is that the ensuing tsunami crippled the backup electrical generators and batteries needed to keep cooling water circulating in the plants after they had been safely shut down. This ultimately led to use of the last line of defense emergency, core cooling system, flooding the entire containment vessel with seawater. While this pretty much assures that the reactors won't ever be used again, as long as the seawater continues to be pumped in, the possibilities of further damage ought to be halted. People have been evacuated, and authorities are taking every precaution, and that, of course, is what we'd like to see. Despite one of the largest earthquakes in the world's history, with accompanying tsunamis, fires, and aftershocks, multiple disasters compounded one on top of another, the primary containment at reactors near the epicenter appear not to have been breached, and the radioactive release appears to have been controlled and minimal. This experience has brought back memories of the 1979 accident at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. Although we remember 3 Mile Island as the worst nuclear accident in U.S. history, it's also important to remember that no one was hurt at 3 Mile Island. As I said before, there's never been a death resulting from a commercial nuclear accident in American history. What happened at 3 Mile Island was basically an operator failure. A valve failed, and when the automatic safety mechanism kicked in, the operators overrode it because they became confused by the number of alarms. 3 Mile Island completely changed the American nuclear industry. The Kennedy Commission, appointed by President Carter, analyzed the problems, made many recommendations, almost all of which have been put into practice. The valve that started the whole thing had failed 9 times before in other reactors, but the manufacturer had tried to keep it a secret. People in the nuclear industry then just didn't talk to each other. Now, safety is a top priority of the nuclear industry. The Institute of Nuclear Power Operations collectively shares best practices to achieve the highest levels of safety as well as reliability. Nuclear operators train for 5 years before they can take over in the control room. They spend 1 week out of every 5 to 6 weeks in a simulator honing their skills. The nuclear companies have special emergency teams that can be dispatched anywhere in the country at a moment's notice. A Nuclear Regulatory Commission inspector practically lives on site. What's more, every reactor in the country is on the hook for $100 million if something goes wrong at another reactor. As you can imagine, they watch each other very carefully. And I've talked with any number of Navy veterans who had experience with nuclear commands, and one reason I'm confident that there haven't been any nuclear reactor accidents in the nuclear Navy that have killed anyone over the last half-century is because the responsibility for the safety of that reactor goes right up to the captain of the vessel. All this wasn't the same at Chernobyl, the infamous 1986 Soviet accident. Chernobyl involved 60 immediate deaths and radiation exposures that, according to the World Health Organization, may eventually result in 4,000 cancers. But Chernobyl was a completely different kind of accident and the result of different technology. More than that, the Soviets hadn't built a containment structure at Chernobyl. The containment structures at these Japanese reactors, 40 to 80 inches thick concrete and steel, appear, as we speak this afternoon, to have withstood an 8.9 magnitude earthquake, a tsunami, power failure, and explosion. Mr. President, there are gas and oil fires raging in Japan. Water and sewer systems are damaged. The possibility of disease and starvation are imminent. There are a great many things to worry about, in addition to the problems with the Japanese reactor. There are tens of thousands of people still unaccounted for. Right now, the effort needs to be helping those who need help, containing further damage and risk, and getting Japan back up and running again. Then we can take the lessons learned from this earthquake and tsunami and apply them to make our nuclear plants as safely as possible and help the world do the same. America's 104 nuclear reactors provide, as I mentioned earlier, 20% of our electricity, 70% of our clean electricity. Japan has 54 reactors and gets 30% of its electricity from nuclear. France gets 80% of its electricity from nuclear power. The United States invented nuclear power, but the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has not issued a construction license for a new reactor in more than 30 years. There are 65 reactors under construction around the world outside the United States right now, but only one of those 65 is in the United States, and that's the construction of a previously halted project at the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Japanese and the French have surged into the lead in terms of nuclear power and are now being challenged by Korea and Russia on the international market. And China, with 27 nuclear reactors currently under construction, will soon join them all. Nuclear power today provides about 15% of the world's electricity. There are always risks with every form of energy. It's important that we be clear about the risks that each type of energy poses. But it's also important to remember that we don't abandon highway systems because bridges and overpasses collapse during earthquakes. The 1.6 million of us who fly daily would not stop flying after a tragic airplane crash. We cannot stop drilling after a tragic oil spill unless we want to rely more on foreign oil, run up our prices, turn our oil drilling over to a few big oil companies, and all our oil hauling over to more leaky tankers. 34,000 people die in motor vehicle accidents every year, but we don't stop driving because we have to get our children to work and our children to school and ourselves to work. In all of these cases, when there are accidents, we do our best to examine the tragedies and make our continued operation and our lives as safe as possible. That's what we need to do here. Our reactors in the United States are built to the highest standards in the world. The chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission said in a press briefing today, right now, we believe that the nuclear power plants in this country operate safely and securely. The chairman said nuclear power plants in the United States are designed to very high standards for earthquake effects. All our plants are designed to withstand significant natural phenomena like earthquakes, tornadoes, tsunamis. We will take whatever steps are necessary, the chairman continued, to ensure the safety and security of nuclear power plants in the country. But right now we believe we have a very strong program in place. As we get more information from Japan, said the chairman of the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission, as this immediate crisis ultimately comes to an end, we will look at whatever information we can gain from this event and see if there are any changes we need to make in our system. The Deputy Secretary of Energy said nuclear power has been a critical component of the United States energy portfolio. The White House press secretary on behalf of President Obama said nuclear power remains a part of the President's overall energy plan. Despite the fact that there has never been a death as a result of the operation of a commercial American reactor, nor in our nuclear navy, which has been using reactors in its ships and submarines since the 1950s, our goal should be to continue every effort to try to make certain that the operation of our existing and new nuclear power plants are as safe as possible. For example, some have suggested that so-called passive cooling systems that operate on natural convection currents and don't need pumping would prevent the problems that arose in Japan when the backup power to pump water was lost. Mr. President, nuclear power is a demanding but manageable technology. As we move forward, let us learn the proper lessons from this Japanese experience to make sure that in the United States and in the world, we are even better prepared for the unexpected events of the future. Thank the President, and I yield the floor. The absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Kaka.
Mr. President.
The senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I ask consent to call the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection. The morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, James Emmanuel Boasberg of the District of Columbia to be United States District Judge.
Under the previous order, there will be 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled between the two leaders and their designees.
President, I suggest you have some quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President.
The senator from Vermont.
President, I ask consent to call the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, today the Senate will consider judicial nomination. I've been talking about since last year. As the clerk reported, Judge Boasberg has been nominated. He's been nominated as one of 2 nominees to fill vacancies that plagued the District Court, the District of Columbia, our nation's capital, for some time. In the closing days of the last session, we were able to confirm 2 additional nominees to fill vacancies on this court. This is another of the nominations that could, in my view, should have been considered and confirmed last year. Judge Boasberg has outstanding credentials. He was appointed to be a judge in D.C. by President George W. Bush in 2002. He has a wealth of experience. He presided over approximately 500 cases. He's a former assistant U.S. attorney. He received the highest peer review rating of well qualified from the Standing Committee in the Federal Judiciary of the American Bar Association. Yet, as we proceed with this nomination, Senate Republicans have objected to proceeding to the nomination of Amy Jackson. Both Judge Boasberg and Ms. Jackson were reported without opposition by the Judiciary Committee last year and again earlier this year. In other words, he was reported without opposition. She was reported without opposition. Then again this year, he was reported without opposition. She was reported without opposition. But they're only allowing him to go forward and not her. I think that's a mistake. I think it's a bad mistake. Chief Judge Lamberth wrote to Senate leaders last November urging action by the Senate to fill the vacancies that exist on the District Court for the District of Columbia. We could and should have acted on both these nominations last year in response to that request. Well, I'm glad we're ending the wait for Judge Boasberg. The refusal to act on Jackson is just another example of needless delays. She, Ms. Jackson, is a former assistant U.S. attorney with outstanding credentials and experience. She, too, received the Standing Committee in the Federal Judiciary, the American Bar Association's highest peer review rating of well qualified, as did he. She's the representative of the District of Columbia. Representative Norton has called her one of the top practitioners in one of the district's top law firms, and has strongly endorsed her nomination. In addition to Judge Boasberg, there are still 10 judicial nominees left waiting for Senate consideration, having been reviewed by the Judiciary Committee. Nominees to fill 2 judicial emergency vacancies in New York, a judicial emergency vacancy on the Second Circuit, a judicial emergency vacancy in California, and vacancies on the Federal and D.C. Circuit, a vacancy in Oregon, and 2 vacancies in Virginia. Let's debate them and vote them up or down. I consider the fact that they all came out of the Judiciary Committee with a solid vote. We ought to be working to confirm them before the upcoming recess. We should be working to clear the calendar before that recess. That's what a return to regular order entails. But the real price paid for these unnecessary delays, and we had one here recently that was confirmed unanimously, but had to wait for a year on the calendar to be voted on. If you have these unnecessary delays, you mean the judges remain overburdened, the American people who depend upon them are denied hearings and justice in a timely fashion. When Chief Judge Lamberth wrote to Senator Reid and Senator McConnell last November, he noted Senate action to fill the vacancies in D.C. was needed so the citizens of the District of Columbia and the federal government and other litigants who rely on the court could receive the high quality of justice they deserve. He wrote about the severe impact these judicial vacancies were having. Noted that their caseload of that court includes many involving national security issues. In fact, I asked consent that a copy of the Chief Judge's letter be included in the record at the end of my statement.
Without objection.
Also asked unanimous consent to insert in the record at the end of my statement recent articles in the Palm Beach Post and the Associated Press.
Without objection.
Without the delays, thank you. The Florida paper reporting the crises in South Florida and the watch list for federal courts with high caseloads, high vacancies. During President Bush's first term, his first 4 tumultuous years in office, we proceeded to confirm 205 of his judicial nominations. So far in President Obama's third year in office, the Senate's only considered 72. I ask consent that my full statement be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I should...
Before you present that, do you want to fully divide the time?
Mr. President, I'm about to suggest the absence of quorum, but I ask unanimous consent that when I suggest the absence of quorum, that the time be equally divided on both sides.
Without objection. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President.
Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, I ask consent that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, you've heard a lot of talk about with the trouble in the Middle East. People are saying that oil prices are going up, and therefore the pain at the gas pump is being felt because there is this shakiness on the oil markets. Now you hear the commentary, well, we ought to be solving this problem by drilling more in the U.S., and of course, in essence, what people are talking about is they want to drill more in the Gulf of Mexico. Of course, there's plenty of opportunity to drill in the Gulf of Mexico. There are 30 million acres that are already under lease that have not been drilled. There are 7 million acres that are being drilled under lease. But there's an additional 30 million acres in the Gulf of Mexico under lease. And so there's plenty of opportunity. So there's a lot more opportunity for domestic drilling. But what I want to talk about today is it's this simplified message that if we just drill more domestically, which we clearly have the capacity to, that's going to solve the problem. And that's not the problem, and that's not the reason for why the gas prices are going up like they are. Now, I'll grant you that whenever there is an oil-producing region of the world where there is a disruption, then that does have some effect on the price of oil. But what we have seen is an extraordinary spike in just the last couple of months in the price of oil. And I want to try to point out to the Senate why this senator thinks, and a number of my colleagues join me, why that spike in gas prices is going up. There is further evidence that our energy markets are no longer governed just by the economic dictums of supply and demand when it comes to oil prices. And that's what I want to talk about. Now, it's simply this. The speculators are back. We saw the speculators in oil futures contracts. We saw their handiwork 2 years ago when the price of oil hit an all-time high of $147 a barrel. And this time, the speculators are seizing on the turmoil in the Middle East and North Africa to use that as an excuse to drive this price of oil sky high. And yet, recent upheavals abroad have had little, if any, effect on the actual supply of oil. Again, coming back to the economic theories of supply and demand. Libya, for example, controls only 2% of the world's oil supply. Well, Mr. President, there's a key piece of evidence that points the finger at these condo flippers of the commodities market. Data from the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, reveals that since January, when the protests began in Egypt, speculators have increased their betting on future oil price increases by more than 38%. And meanwhile, legitimate hedgers for oil futures contracts, legitimate hedgers like airlines and shipping companies and oil companies have actually reduced their holdings in oil futures contracts. Now, for example, all you need to do is to see what's happening as represented on this chart. You see closely how the rise in oil prices, the red line, tracks the increase in speculative activity, the white line. A long position in a futures contract means that you are betting that the price of oil will go up, and therefore you buy a contract to buy oil at a determined amount in the future. That's what this chart is about. So if you go over here, on January the 25th of this year, the day that the protests began in Egypt, the speculative money was on long-held positions in just over 217,000 West Texas Intermediate crude oil futures contracts. West Texas Intermediate crude is the standard by which they judge. And when the protests began in Egypt, they were down at 217,000 futures contracts. Well, that's the equivalent of about 217 million barrels of oil. On March 8th, the last day for which we have the data, these same speculators held the equivalent of more than 301 million barrels of crude, which was an increase of 38% from 217 to 301. Now, look how closely the price of oil tracks these swings. This is the speculative buying or betting in futures contracts, the white line. Look how closely the price of oil follows, the red line. During the same period, from January the 25th to March the 8th, the price of oil climbed from $85 a barrel all the way up to $105 a barrel. That's an increase of nearly 24%. And guess who the loser is in this game of profit gouging? It's the American consumer. Higher gasoline prices mean less money for anything that the American consumer has to buy. And at the end of the day, guess who else is the big loser? It's the American economy. And so these speculative bubbles in oil prices are becoming more and more common. We saw it in the summer of 2008 when oil spiked up to an unbelievable $147 per barrel, only to plummet almost 80% in just a few months later. Now, you can't say that going from $147 a barrel all of a sudden down to $30 a barrel back in 2008 had anything to do with the supply and demand. There had to be another influencing factor. Well, because of this, last year when we passed the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, Congress empowered the Commodities Futures Trading Commission to rein in excessive speculation to keep the commodities markets from flying off the rails, just like it is in the last 2 months. And yet, the Commission, the CFTC, has yet to finalize new rules to govern the speculative position limits. And meantime, what happens is speculators continue to buy $100 worth of oil futures with just $6 down, 6% down to buy oil contracts for futures. And I believe that the law that we passed last year has given the CFTC an extremely effective tool at its disposal that it could use to discourage excessive energy speculation and bring down gas prices that our American consumers are now finding that are hurting their pocketbooks so much. And that authority is the authority to impose higher margin requirements on oil futures contracts. So instead of $6, they could require that there be more than 6% that they would have to pay down on buying a future oil contract. Now, in the current system, some ordinary investors have to put down as much as 50% in order to buy things, while financial speculators have to post only 6% to buy a future contract in oil. That doesn't seem to me to be fair and is leading to this kind of system of which there is now pain at the pump. Well, these kinds of margin requirements are not set by federal regulators, but rather by the exchanges themselves. And for the same reason that we don't let pharmaceutical companies approve of their own drugs, we shouldn't let futures exchanges self-regulate by setting their own margin requirements. Fortunately, in a section of the Dodd-Frank bill, Section 736, Congress removed the broad statutory restriction that prohibited the CFTC from setting those margin requirements. And that section authorizes the CFTC to call for higher margin requirements in order to protect the financial integrity so that this kind of thing doesn't happen. So, Mr. President, I'm calling on the CFTC now to exercise the authority that the Congress signed into law by the President gave them last July. I'm asking them to get going on this. There is a letter that has been circulated here among the senators encouraging the CFTC to use the Commission's power to increase margin requirements on these oil speculators. I want to urge my colleagues who are listening to join in this letter as it is circulated among your offices. And under the Dodd-Frank Act, these new margin requirements would take effect as soon as July. But the CFTC must begin the rulemaking process now. Because if we don't, and you get into the summer driving season, you know what's going to happen here. And this is March. It's just going to keep going up and up. Now, I want to be clear, where those who have a legitimate reason, like airlines, like shipping companies, like oil companies, to buy future contracts, that margin level would not apply to them. It would only apply to the speculators. Imposing a higher margin level on speculators, it's consistent with existing exchanges practices. For example, the New York Mercantile Exchange. It's the major trading platform on oil futures. It imposes different margin rates on speculators as compared to bona fide hedgers. So, Mr. President, anybody that's been at the gas pump recently knows that this is a real issue, and they're asking us to do something about it. And then we hear in return, oh, it's supply and demand. I'm trying to prick that balloon and bust that bubble. Congress and the administration need to be out front, doing everything that we can to ensure that the price of oil reflects the real supply and demand, not the irrational, speculative fervor. And with the right policies, we can discourage the damage that excessive speculation is doing. So I'm going to ask two things of my colleagues. I'm going to ask that you all take a look at this letter that's being circulated to go to Commissioner Gensler, the chairman of the CFTC, and don't fall for the notion that just more drilling is going to put an end to the spiral. I'm all for the drilling, and all of those acres out there that are already leased, I'm all for it if it's done safely. But guess what we're hearing? We're starting to hear drill, baby, drill. But you know, facts are stubborn things, Mr. President. Even if there was expanded drilling in the U.S., it's not going to affect the price of gas in the short term or even over the next half a dozen years. And that's largely because the U.S. holds 2 to 3% of the world's supply, which is not enough to affect prices globally. Further, the truth is that the oil and gas companies have this 30 million acres that's leased but not drilled offshore and another 30 million acres onshore, and they're not even drilling yet. And so, simply put, the attempts to link the recent increases in the price of oil to the need to increase drilling is just off the mark. Frankly, you know, we haven't changed the way that we do business with oil companies. Unfortunately, it's been just a little less than a year since the Deepwater Horizon oil rig exploded, and we know what damage that did to the fishery, the tourism, the economy of the entire Gulf region. A lot of oil is still there, and American citizens continue to fight to get their lost claims paid. We're not going to know for years to come what the long-term impacts are going to be, but certainly the economic damage is rising and rising. And even worse, if another spill happened today, the responsible party would still have only a liability cap of $75 million. So we've got to address that. But in the meantime, we've got to confront this, and we've got to confront the high gas prices. And I think we need a multi-pronged approach, and that includes getting the CFTC to do their job. Mr. President, I yield the floor.